Imagine sitting down at your computer, right? It's just a random Tuesday, and you decide to ask a simple, completely idle historical question about World War I.
Right, as you do.
Yeah, as you do. But then, 3 hours later, you've somehow accidentally built this entirely original theological defense for female kingship.
Oh, wow.
And not only that, but you are simultaneously putting King Henry V on trial for medieval war crimes.
It's quite the afternoon.
It really is.
Yeah.
Today, we are opening up a wildly unusual document that takes us on that exact crazy ride. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are exploring an excerpt from something called a multiverse journal.
Yes.
Specifically, it's index number 2241, written by a man named Stephen Work, and this was dated June 9th, 2026. And the mission of this deep dive today is to basically trace this astonishing intellectual journey.
It really is a remarkable piece of writing. And I think mostly because of how it completely defies the way we usually consume information today.
Right. We just want the quick answer.
Exactly. We are so accustomed to this totally transactional internet. Like, you want a fact, you query a search engine or a chatbot, it spits out a sterile bulleted summary, and you just move on with your day.
Yeah.
But Work's journal is, it's the complete antithesis of that. He basically allowed his curiosity to completely dictate the pace, just wandering through centuries of law and geopolitics and theology.
And the reason we're bringing this to you, the listener, is because if you have ever fallen down one of those massive rabbit holes of curiosity, like on Wikipedia at 2 a.m.
Oh, we've all been there.
We really have. Or, if you ever feel completely overcome by the sheer volume of historical and moral information out there, and you just crave a method to actually make sense of it all without getting lost in the weeds, then this deep dive is absolutely for you.
It's a masterclass in synthesis, really.
It is. We are going to trace Work's intellectual domino effect, literally step by step. But before we get into the kings and the royal bloodlines and the grim medieval sieges, we really need to establish how this journey actually happened.
Right. The method.
Yeah, the method itself is fascinating because he was having this unhurried, rambling, 3-hour conversation with an AI chat assistant, specifically Claude.
And that methodology is really the foundation of the whole piece. Because Work is writing this in 2026, which is a time when the cultural anxiety around artificial intelligence is, it's practically deafening.
Oh, yeah. Everyone's terrified.
Exactly. He directly addresses this really uniformly grim press surrounding AI. People are deeply worried that we're all just growing mentally slack.
Right.
That we're outsourcing our critical thinking to these machines that, frankly, frequently produce confident errors or hallucinations, as they call them.
Yeah, just making things up but sounding really smart while doing it.
Exactly. And there is this pervasive dread that humanity is just leaning on silicon instead of leaning on God or a confessor or, actual human friends.
And he doesn't brush those fears under the rug either. Like, he actually states right up front that he shares those concerns.
He does.
But he presents this specific 3-hour session as a counter instance. He's essentially saying, look, the critics aren't entirely wrong, but they are missing a massive piece of the picture.
Right, because they aren't looking at how this tool operates when a human being completely refuses to surrender the driver's seat.
Yes, and that division of labor is so crucial to understanding his whole method here. He is very explicit that the inspiration, the underlying faith, and the originating intuitions, those belonged entirely to him.
Absolutely. The AI didn't spontaneously generate his spiritual conviction.
Oh.
It didn't tell him why a specific saint was suddenly laid on his heart for reflection. The human soul and the human intuition are the engine of this whole thing.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because if he is providing all the inspiration and all the direction, what is the AI actually contributing?
That's the big question.
Right. Because a lot of people might hear this and just say, well, he's doing all the heavy lifting and basically treating the AI like a glorified Wikipedia search bar.
But what's fascinating here is that it is far more active than a search bar. Work describes the AI as providing this incredible encyclopedic recall across totally disparate fields.
Like history and theology.
Yeah, history, theology, really dense civil law. But more importantly, it verified specific, obscure texts for him.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, for example, if Work vaguely remembered a theological argument from, say, Justin Martyr, or a highly specific passage from Thomas Aquinas' Summa.
Right, the stuff you kind of remember from college but can't quite place.
Exactly. The AI could instantly pinpoint the exact chapter and edition. It applied a totally consistent evidentiary standard to the entire conversation.
I see where you're going, but let me pause you there because I have to push back a little.
Go for it.
If you're using a machine to validate your own arguments, isn't there a massive risk of confirmation bias? Like you just prompt the machine to agree with your theory and it just nods along and says, yes, Stephen, you are a historical genius.
And that is normally a huge trap. But that is the beauty of how he actively structured this interaction. He demanded that the AI push back.
Oh, he actually asked for resistance.
Yes, and it did. It provided really honest resistance to his flawed logic. At one point in the journal, Work actually confused one medieval king for another.
Which is easy to do, honestly. There are a lot of Henrys and Edwards.
Right, a simple human slip. But that slip would have completely invalidated his entire historical argument. The AI caught it, flagged it immediately, and forced him to correct his premise.
Wow.
Furthermore, it completely rejected his reliance on this old lazy fallacy that victory proves the cause just.
Oh, like mice bakes, right?
Exactly. When he tried to use a historical military victory to prove that a side was morally right, the AI essentially threw a yellow flag on the play.
Ah.
It demanded stricter moral grounds. And Work specifically calls the AI a whetstone in this context.
A whetstone, like the rock you used to grind an edge onto a steel blade. I love that.
Yeah, it's a perfect image.
It sounds like treating the AI not as an oracle that you just blindly obey, but as a really heavily read sparring partner in a boxing ring.
That's a great way to look at it.
Like, you have to bring the punching power, right? You have to dictate the footwork and the overall strategy of the fight, but the AI basically holds up the mitts to keep your technique honest.
Exactly.
If you drop your guard, like if you rely on a logical fallacy or get your centuries mixed up, it pops you in the jaw just to remind you of the rules of the ring.
I love that analogy. A whetstone only works if there is a human actually pushing the steel against it. The criticism that AI makes us think less, it really only holds water if we are asking the machine to do the thinking for us.
Right.
Work is demonstrating how to use the machine to think more, and to think with far more rigor than a single human memory typically allows.
Because no one remembers every page of Aquinas.
Right. He argues that this kind of rambling associative inquiry isn't a defect of the method, it is the entire point. When you have an interlocutor that never gets tired, doesn't try to flatter you, and remembers exactly where the conversation started 3 hours ago, you can safely wander off the beaten path and find things you never expected.
So let's actually follow that wandering path, because the domino effect here is wild. Let's look at the very first domino. He sits down, opens the chat window, and his opening intuition is a question about World War I.
Yes, starting in the 20th century.
Right. He wants to know why the United States entered the war, and specifically why they entered on the side of the British and the French rather than the Central Powers.
And that seemingly straightforward historical question quickly expands into this massive discussion about grand geopolitics. They start talking about Britain's overarching historical strategy.
Right.
For centuries, Britain has operated as what political scientists call an offshore balancer.
I've heard this term. This is basically the idea that Britain, sitting comfortably on its little island, never really wanted to conquer mainland Europe.
Right. They didn't want the headache.
But they were utterly terrified of anyone else doing it, so they always threw their money, and especially their navy, behind whoever was losing on the continent just to keep Europe tied up in a perpetual stalemate.
And you can trace that strategy perfectly through modern history.
Yeah.
When Spain, under Philip II, threatened to dominate Europe in the 16th century, Britain stood against them. When France grew way too powerful under Louis XIV and then later under Napoleon, Britain funded the massive coalitions against them.
Right. They were always the counterweight.
Exactly. When Germany threatened continental hegemony under the Kaiser, and then again under Hitler, Britain stepped in as the balancer, is a very tidy, cohesive geopolitical narrative.
But something in that tidy narrative bothered Stephen Work. His intuition snagged on it.
He felt something was off.
Yeah, he realized that this whole offshore balancer identity was actually a relatively modern development. If you rewind the clock a few hundred years, England didn't want to balance the power on the continent at all.
No, not even a little bit.
They wanted to hoard it.
They absolutely did. During the medieval period, the Norman, Angevin, and Plantagenet kings of England didn't view themselves as these isolated islanders playing defense.
Right.
They held vast, wealthy territories in France.
Right.
They didn't want to prevent a continental hegemon. They actively campaigned and bled to become one.
And that ambition, that greed for land, is the match that lit the Hundred Years' War.
Exactly.
England wasn't acting as a noble defensive balancer. They were the absolute aggressor, openly claiming the French crown. And work zeroes in on King Henry V, the famous warrior king, right?
Guy from the Shakespeare play.
Yes. Henry V aggressively pressed the English claim to rule France, and he claimed it as the heir of his great-grandfather, King Edward III. But okay, I have to stop the historical train here for a second, because this logic always baffles me when I read about this era.
It's very confusing.
Edward III was an English king. Henry V was an English king. How on earth do you just point across the English Channel at a completely sovereign, massive nation and say, actually, I'm the king of that too?
Right. Well, this is the exact hinge of the entire centuries-long dispute. The English claim to the French throne rested exclusively on female line transmission.
Okay, break that down.
So Edward III's claim ran through his mother, Isabella of France. Isabella was the daughter of the French king Philip IV.
Okay, so she had direct royal French blood.
Yes. And when all of Isabella's brothers died without leaving male heirs, the direct male line of the French Capetian dynasty completely ended.
Oh, wow.
So Edward III, sitting over in England, looked at the French throne and essentially argued, look, my mother was the daughter of your king. The blood right to the throne passes through her, directly to me.
So that is the crux of a century of bloodshed. The whole Hundred Years' War basically boils down to one incredibly high-stakes legal question. Is a royal claim valid if it passes through a woman?
Yes, that's what millions of people eventually died over. And to block this massive English power grab, the French had to construct an impenetrable legal defense.
They had to say, no, absolutely not.
Right, and the way they did it is one of the most stunning historical revelations work unpacks with his AI partner. The French erected something called the Salic Doctrine,
Which basically claimed that no royal right, no crown, and no sovereign authority could ever pass through a woman under any circumstances.
Exactly. And they presented this to the world as an ancient, sacred, completely unbreakable law of the French Constitution. They claimed they traced it all the way back to the original Lex Salica.
Which was what, exactly?
It was the ancient law of the Salian Franks from the early 6th century, around, 507 to 511 AD.
Okay, but the reality here, and this completely blew my mind when I read the journal, is that the Salic law, as it pertained to the crown, was a total fabrication.
A complete forgery.
It was a late, deliberate construction. Let's look at the actual Lex Salica from 500 AD. It wasn't some soaring constitutional document about the divine right of kings.
Not at all.
It was a gritty, everyday, local legal code about private land. It was about what happens if you steal someone's pigs and what the fines are for assaulting your neighbor.
Right. It was very mundane.
There was a specific chapter in it called De Allodio, which dealt with inheritances. And it simply stated that a father's landed property, his actual dirt, went to his sons, while his daughters inherited personal property like, wealth or items or jewelry.
It was literally a neighborhood property law.
Yeah.
It mentioned absolutely nothing about the inheritance of the crown or the kingdom or the nation.
Zero.
But fast forward to the year 1413, right as this massive dispute with England is reaching a fever pitch. A French royal secretary and diplomat named Jean de Montreuil is writing a polemical treatise to defend the French position. And he digs up this ancient property law, and he deliberately alters it. He takes the rule about private dirt and inserts 2 Latin words into the text. In regno.
Meaning of the kingdom.
Yes. By quietly slipping those 2 words into a citation of the ancient text, he magically transformed a local rule about who inherits the family farm into a foundational constitutional law, excluding women from inheriting the nation itself.
Wait, this is like, when a homeowners association has a 50-year-old covenant about who is legally allowed to park a commercial vehicle in a neighborhood driveway?
Yes. A very mundane local restriction.
It is exactly like someone sneaking into the county archives, digging up that boring driveway rule, and quietly writing the words, "and who can be president of the United States," into the margins.
That's hilarious, but yes.
And then they successfully used that forged margin note to literally overthrow the government and change the entire line of succession.
That is precisely the scale of the deception we're talking about here. And honestly, the most shocking part is that it actually worked.
It worked.
Later French jurists just built upon Jean de Montreuil's forgery for the next 80 years. By the time we reached the 16th century, this altered, weaponized text had been elevated into the first law of the Franks.
Wow.
They had repeated the lie so many times and with such fake authority that it just became an unassailable national myth.
And they didn't just stop at forging the legal document, because once people started questioning the logic of it, the French jurists had to come up with philosophical and theological reasons why a woman couldn't transmit a crown.
They needed backup.
Right. And this is where it gets incredibly dense, but work breaks it down beautifully. The jurists started claiming that kingship was essentially priestly.
Oh, yes.
And since Catholic theology held that women couldn't be priests, therefore, women couldn't hold or transmit royal civil power.
They were trying to borrow the sacred authority of the church to prop up their forged political document.
Exactly.
The text notes that they relied heavily on a concept found in the supplement to Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. Specifically, this concept of defectus sexus, or a defect of sex.
Okay, we definitely need to translate that for a modern ear because defect of sex sounds incredibly offensive to a 21st century listener. What was Aquinas actually arguing there, and how did the French twist it?
Right, this sounds terrible today. But in scholastic theology, Aquinas' argument regarding holy orders is strictly about sacramental sign value.
Okay, what does that mean?
The priesthood is a sacrament where the priest acts in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. Because Christ was incarnated historically as a male, Aquinas argued that only a male can serve as the natural sacramental sign in that specific divine spiritual office.
So it's about symbolism and sacramental representation.
Exactly. It is strictly about the capacity to signify Christ in a divine sacrament. But work points out the massive, glaring flaw in the French jurist's logic here. A civil crown, the right to tax peasants, command armies, fix roads, and build castles, is not a sacrament.
No.
It doesn't signify the priesthood at all. It is a gritty, earthly, civil right. The French were completely conflating divine sacramental institution with basic human political administration.
They were trying to staple a really high-level theological concept onto a gritty political dispute to make their forged HOA rule look like the Word of God.
Perfectly said.
Yeah.
And when you pull back and look at the broader European context at the time, the absolute Salic exclusion of women was a bizarre outlier.
It wasn't normal.
No. Most of Europe practiced some form of quasi-Salic or cognatic succession. It was entirely normal for a king who only had a daughter to be succeeded by that daughter's son.
Okay, so the English claim actually made sense in the context of the era.
Oh, completely. The French doctrine wasn't some universal law of nature. It was a desperate human convention masquerading as fundamental natural law.
So Stephen Work, sitting at his computer, has just spent hours with Claude completely dismantling the legal and theological foundation of the French defense.
Step by step.
He's exposed the Salic law as a manufactured earthly rule, but he isn't satisfied just tearing down the French argument.
No, he wants to build something.
Right. He wants to proactively prove that the English theory that royal transmission through a woman is inherently lawful and natural is actually true.
Yeah.
And to do this, he seeks a higher, unshakable precedent. And this is where the journal takes a breathtaking pivot. He finds his proof by looking at two highly specific women, Joan of Arc and the Virgin Mary.
And this transition is where the deeply personal, spiritual nature of Work's journal intersects with his rigorous historical analysis.
Yeah, it gets very personal here.
He introduces Joan of Arc not just as a historical figure on a battlefield, but as his own confirmation saint. He writes about choosing her as his patron before he even fully understood the depths of traditional Catholicism.
And his reasoning is incredibly vulnerable to read. He talks about struggling with the familial spirit of pride and unchastity.
Right.
And he was drawn to Joan of Arc because her specific virtues were the direct antidote to his own personal flaws. He saw her absolute emptied humility as the weapon against his pride, and her radical virginity as the counter to his unchastity.
And consider who Joan of Arc was, historically, within the exact conflict we are discussing right now, the 100 Years' War.
Right. The war over the Salic law.
She was an unlettered peasant girl. She had absolutely no knowledge of statecraft, no military training, no political pedigree whatsoever. Yet, she led armies to victory and personally saw Charles VII crowned at Rheims in 1429.
It's still one of the craziest stories in history.
It really is. She exercised an unfathomable level of king-making authority.
But, and this is the key to Work's entire argument, she did it as an obedient instrument. She transmitted a crown without reigning.
Yes.
She didn't march into Rheims, put the crown on her own head, and declare herself Queen of France. She facilitated the passing of royal authority to someone else.
Which triggers the ultimate aha moment of his entire 3-hour session.
Here we go.
Work looks beyond the medieval period to the supreme royal succession in history, according to Christian theology, the Davidic royalty of Jesus Christ. That kingship, the most important royal bloodline in the history of the world for a Christian, was transmitted entirely through a woman, the Blessed Virgin Mary.
I have to admit, when I first read this part of the journal, my jaw genuinely dropped.
It's a huge leap.
He is taking the ultimate foundational mystery of human history, the Incarnation, and using it as a legal precedent to settle a medieval succession dispute over the French throne.
I know, it sounds crazy at first.
He's essentially arguing, look, if it's a valid mechanism for God, it's a valid mechanism for England.
It is a stunning associative leap, but the logic is remarkably tight once you actually break it down with them.
Okay, walk us through it.
According to Orthodox Christian theology, Christ's flesh came from Mary alone. He was conceived by the Holy Ghost without a human father.
Right.
Therefore, if Jesus is of the house and lineage of David, according to the flesh, which the scriptures insist he is, the Davidic descent must have come through Mary.
Because there was literally no one else for it to come from. Which means Mary herself had to be of the royal house of David. She was the sole biological vessel for the royal bloodline.
Exactly. And here is the apologetic work built from that premise. If God himself, the author of nature and natural law, ordained that the highest, most vital royal lineage in the history of the universe be transmitted through a woman, then female line transmission cannot possibly be intrinsically disordered.
Oh, wow.
It cannot be against nature, and it cannot be a violation of divine law, because God does not use mechanisms that violate the inherent natural order he himself created.
The symmetry he finds here is just beautiful. You have Mary, who transmits the King of Kings without ever reigning as a sovereign herself.
Right.
And then you have Joan of Arc, centuries later, crowning an earthly king without ever ascending the throne herself. Work's argument completely isolates the concept of transmission and separates it entirely from female sovereignty.
That's the crucial distinction.
He isn't arguing that a woman must rule in her own right. He's proving that a woman is fully capable of carrying and passing on the sovereign right to a male heir.
But a bold theological argument like this is really only as good as its ability to survive aggressive counterinterrogation.
And this is where the AI comes back in.
Exactly. Because Work is using Claude as a scholastic whetstone, he is forced to build strict guardrails around his intuition. He has to anticipate the objections and answer them formally, almost like a medieval debate.
Right, because if you throw out a massive claim like, the Virgin Mary proves the English had the right to rule France, historians and theologians are going to come out of the woodwork to tear it apart.
Oh, absolutely.
So Work sets up these distinct guardrails. First, he establishes what he calls the modesty of the argument.
Yes, very important.
He admits that this argument wins the principled war, meaning it proves that female transmission isn't a crime against nature, but he totally concedes the narrower ground.
Meaning that a civil earthly realm like France still has the legal right to pass a positive, localized law excluding women from the throne if it really wants to.
They can just write a law.
Exactly. A sovereign nation can invent its own inheritance rules.
Yeah.
Work's point is simply that they cannot claim their local rule is a universal law of nature or a divine mandate.
I see.
They can say, we don't want women to inherit, but they can't say God and nature forbid it. That is a very intellectually honest limitation to put on his own theory.
Okay, then he faces the first major theological objection, which he calls the sui generis objection.
This is a classic one.
The pushback goes like this. You cannot compare Jesus Christ to an earthly king. Christ is unique, he's divine, and he's eternal. Trying to map the rules of his divine kingship onto the gritty, tax-collecting civil kingship of a medieval nation is completely comparing apples to oranges.
It's a very common objection when mixing theology and politics.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But Work's reply threads the needle perfectly here. He clarifies that his argument does not rest on Christ's divine kingship.
Or does it?
No, because no human creature could ever transmit divine kingship. That's absurd. His argument rests strictly on Christ's human, Davidic, earthly dynastic lineage.
Ah.
The literal flesh and blood inheritance of the throne of David in first century Judea.
So he's saying the biology of the Incarnation is still biology. It's
Exactly.
a natural fact embedded within a divine mystery, and natural facts are generalizable to other human situations, like succession logs.
Precisely. Which leads to the second objection, and honestly, this one I find particularly fascinating because it gets deep into the legal weeds of the Bible. It's the Joseph loophole.
Oh man, I was absolutely waiting for this one because if you open the Gospel of Matthew, the genealogy right at the beginning traces the royal throne title not through Mary, but through Joseph, the legal father.
Right, it tracks the men.
So if you are a French Salic jurist, you just point at that page and say, look, even in the Bible, the royal title has to run through the men. The legal father supplies the title, not the mother.
It looks like a fatal flaw that totally torpedoes his entire premise.
It really does. How does he get out of that?
Well, work turns it completely inside out.
Huh.
He argues that Joseph had to supply the legal title only because of the miraculous virginal nature of the conception.
Okay, wait, I need you to break it down further.
Let's do the biological and legal math here. In a normal, everyday human generation, a father exists, right?
Right.
And in that normal scenario, the lineage that a woman carries brings its inherent title with it.
Right.
But without a human father, the child would be legally fatherless under the strict customs of that day, which vastly complicates the transmission of a dynastic title.
Oh, I see.
Joseph's role in supplying the legal title was a specific legal remedy for a miraculous exception, the physical absence of a human father.
Because it was a virgin birth.
Exactly. It was an artifact of a fatherless generation, not a universal decree that women cannot transmit a title. Work basically argues it is the exception that proves the rule.
Wow.
Where nature operates normally, where a father is present, like with Edward III's parents, the royal line a woman carries inherently conveys its right to her offspring.
Okay, I actually see the logic there. That's a really elegant workaround. But what about the third objection, the proving too much problem?
The slippery slope.
Yeah. If you establish that a woman can validly transmit a crown, doesn't that inherently mean a woman can reign as a queen in her own right? Like, if she has the power to give it, doesn't she logically have the power to wield it?
Work is incredibly careful to draw a hard line here.
Yeah.
He replies, no, the argument strictly licenses transmission.
Just transmission.
Yes. It proves that a daughter can carry a crown latently in her blood to pass it to a later son.
Huh.
He points right back to his original anchors to prove this. Mary transmitted the kingship, but she did not reign as the king of Israel.
Right.
Joan of Arc transmitted the crown to Charles VII, but she did not reign as the Queen of France. The right to pass the baton does not automatically grant you the right to run the anchor leg of the relay.
And he doesn't just invent this out of thin air either. He backs this up with heavy patristic witnesses, the early church fathers.
Yeah, he brings the receipts.
He cites St. Ignatius of Antioch, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and the Roman Catechism, all explicitly confirming that Mary was indeed of David's line. So he's proving that the female transmission of the bloodline was absolutely central to early Christian understanding.
It wasn't a fringe theory.
But, I want to push back on this whole framework for a second.
These two.
If a woman can transmit power, but she absolutely cannot hold it, doesn't that just reduce women in this historical era to, like, glorified royal incubators?
That's a very modern and very valid concern.
Right. Surely there is more to their political and cultural power than just quietly holding a title in their DNA until a man is born to take it over.
That is a brilliant question, and it is actually addressed within the text's confirmation section. Work points directly to the structure of the Davidic kingdom itself, looking for the specific station of women within the power structure.
Okay.
And he finds the Gebira, the queen mother.
Right. The queen mother.
Yes. In the ancient polity of David and Solomon, the king's mother held massive official dignity. The text cites the book of 1 Kings. When King Solomon receives his mother, Bathsheba, he doesn't treat her like an incubator.
What does he do?
The scripture specifically says the king stood up to meet her, bowed himself to her, and caused a throne to be set for her at his right hand.
Oh, wow. So even within the ancient biblical blueprint of kingship, there was a deeply honored, officially recognized station for the woman through whom the king comes.
Exactly. She wasn't erased from the narrative at all. She literally sat on a throne at the right hand of power.
It perfectly validates Work's intuition. The transmitter is not a cipher. They have real recognized authority.
Exactly.
But as satisfying as that theological victory is, the deep dive doesn't end there. Because proving that King Henry V had a legitimate theoretical claim to the French throne is really only half the battle.
Right, the theory is nice, but...
You still have to look at how he actually fought to claim it.
And this is where Work shifts gears dramatically. He moves from the lofty heights of theology back down into the muddy, grim, violent reality of history.
Yeah, it gets dark here.
He turns the whetstone of his AI inquiry onto Henry V's actual conduct in prosecuting the war. He evaluates Henry using the rigorous standards of the just war tradition, focusing on two incredibly dark events.
We have to start with Agincourt in 1415.
The famous one.
Right. The battle itself is legendary, the exhausted, outnumbered English archers defeating the massive, shiny French chivalry in the mud.
It's the stuff of legends.
But there is a very dark chapter right in the middle of that battle. Henry V explicitly ordered the killing of French prisoners who had already surrendered.
Yes, he did.
To modern ears, if you shoot a prisoner of war, that is a straight-up, unequivocal war crime.
By the parameters of the modern Geneva Conventions, it absolutely is a war crime. No debate.
Right.
But Work applies the historical and moral framework available at the time, specifically the necessity defense. This was formulated by scholastic thinkers like Francisco de Vitoria and Francisco Suarez. These were 16th century Spanish theologians who were essentially trying to write the ultimate moral rule book for the brutality of warfare.
Okay, so what does the necessity defense actually look like on a muddy battlefield in 1415?
Well, Vitoria and Suarez argued that during the chaos of an active battle, if a genuine, present, and grave threat to the army's survival exists, even those who have surrendered may be killed if basic safety absolutely requires it.
That sounds like a slippery slope.
It is, but look at the situation at Agincourt. It was catastrophic. The English force was exhausted, diseased, and massively outnumbered.
They were dying of dysentery, right?
Yes, they were in terrible shape.
Yeah.
And they had taken an enormous number of prisoners. So many that the prisoners arguably outnumbered their English captors.
Ah, jeez.
And suddenly there was a renewed French attack on the English baggage train in the rear of the camp.
So Henry is looking around, he sees his men being attacked from behind, and he has thousands of armed Frenchmen sitting completely unguarded in the middle of his camp.
Exactly. Those prisoners were a latent fighting force.
They could have easily grabbed weapons off the ground and just overwhelmed the English from within.
Yes. It was a moment of sheer existential terror for the English army. And crucially, Work points out that the killing was halted the very moment the immediate danger passed.
Oh, he stopped it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Once the rear attack was repelled, the order was rescinded, the highest value captives were ultimately spared.
Okay.
So Work concludes that while the act was horrific and certainly not virtuous, the reality of absolute military necessity renders it non-culpable under just war theory.
It was an act of eliminating combatants in potential during active combat, not a premeditated murder of the defenseless after the battle was over.
Precisely.
I mean, I can follow that logic, grim as it is. But then we get to the Siege of Rouen in 1418. And the necessity defense completely falls apart here. This is significantly darker. Henry besieged the massive city of Rouen, attempting to starve it into submission.
Standard siege tactics.
Right. But in late 1418, as the food ran out, the starving city expelled 12,000 bouches inunibles.
Useless mouths.
Yes, useless mouths. These weren't soldiers. They were the elderly, the sick, pregnant women, and young children. The city pushed them out the gates to preserve what little food they had left for the garrison fighting on the walls.
It's horrific.
And Henry refused to let them pass through his siege lines. He refused to feed them. He left 12,000 innocent people trapped in the freezing ditch between the city walls and the English camps.
In the dead of winter.
Over a period of weeks, in the dead of winter, they starved and froze to death in the mud while both armies just watched.
In the initial publication of his journal, Work evaluated this event and fiercely condemned Henry.
I would too.
Right. He stated that this horror could not possibly be laundered by the necessity defense. He concluded that Henry was intentionally using the suffering of innocents as a means to create psychological leverage against the city.
Which is an action the just war tradition forbids without exception. You cannot intentionally target the innocent to achieve a military goal.
Exactly. But then, in a post-publication appendix, Work does something remarkable. He actually revises his initial, highly condemnatory judgment.
Right, really?
Yes. And he introduces a historical method that I think is one of the most profound takeaways for any listener today. He calls it the method of anchors and maps.
Okay, break that down, because I think this applies to a lot more than just medieval history.
It absolutely does. It directly addresses how we reconstruct history and, frankly, how we process the news today. The anchors are the fixed facts of an event.
The indisputable data points we know for certain from the historical record.
Yes, the maps are the different narrative reconstructions of human intent that we drape over those anchors to make sense of them.
So, think about how we all consume information on the internet today. We see a fixed fact, like a short video clip, a single quote, an anchor, and we immediately, almost reflexively, apply the most cynical map to it.
Well, always.
We assume the worst possible intent of the people involved. And Work realizes he fell into exactly that trap. He committed the default map error.
He just assumed the most malicious narrative about Henry's intent without testing if other maps could also fit the established facts.
So to correct this, he forces himself into a really rigorous intellectual exercise. He tries to construct a favorable map, a reconstruction of events that requires the absolute least amount of malice from Henry, while still honoring every single historical anchor point.
And it completely changes the picture.
Okay, I have to push back incredibly hard
I
here.
figured you would.
If Henry V is sitting in his camp with a fully supplied army right outside the walls, letting innocent women and children walk through his lines would have cost him literally nothing but leverage.
Right.
So how on earth could there possibly be a favorable map for letting 12,000 people starve in a ditch?
To understand the favorable map, you have to immerse yourself in the brutal mathematics of medieval siege warfare.
Yeah.
You cannot look at it through the lens of a modern police action.
Okay, lay out the math.
During that siege, roughly 50,000 people starved to death inside the walls of Rouen over 6 months.
50,000.
Yes, the sheer scale of death is staggering. In that context, every single week the siege is shortened, saves lives by the thousands.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Now let's look at the expulsion of the 12,000. The French garrison didn't push them out because they thought Henry would kill them. They pushed them out expecting Henry's Christian conscience to force him to feed them or let them pass.
It was a tactical gambit by the city.
Exactly. It was a calculated move to drain English food stores, or to set a precedent that would completely ruin the effectiveness of the blockade.
Because if a besieged city knows the attacker will happily take on the burden of feeding their civilians, the blockade strategy is totally neutralized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In medieval warfare, the standard textbook countermove to this gambit is to refuse passage. You place the onus entirely back on the city.
Right.
On the favorable map, Henry's expected outcome when he barred their passage was 0 deaths in the ditch.
0 deaths? How could he possibly expect that?
Because he fully expected the French garrison to look down from the walls, see their own grandmothers, their own wives, and their own children freezing outside the gates and surrender.
Oh.
Or at the very least, he expected them to reopen the gates and let them back inside. He assumed he was calling their bluff. He assumed their fundamental humanity would kick in within a matter of days.
Wow, that entirely shifts the moral geometry of the opening move.
Doesn't it?
On that map, Henry wasn't setting out to murder 12,000 people. He was executing a standard tactical counterbluff to force a rapid end to the siege, believing that the city would crack before anyone actually died in the ditch.
But the tragic reality is that the rulers of Rouen were far harder-hearted than he anticipated. They refused to blink.
They kept the gates barred. And when Work applies this anchors and maps method, he realizes something profound. Assigning the horror of Rouen to Henry V alone is a complete falsification of the historical record.
It's just not accurate.
It was a co-authored tragedy. He breaks down the guilt and distributes it among 4 distinct parties, and the breakdown is truly chilling.
It is.
Let's walk through the 4 authors of this horror. Who is number 1?
The first, and arguably most culpable, are the rulers and the military garrison of Rouen itself.
The people inside.
Yes. They committed the originating crime. They gathered their own dependents, their own vulnerable citizens, and cast them out into the freezing mud as a pawn in a military game.
Which is horrific on its own.
And when Henry played the standard counter move and refused them passage, the garrison kept their own gates barred for 7 weeks. They literally stood on the walls and watched their own families slowly die when they had the physical ability to simply open the doors and bring them back inside.
That is just, it's unimaginable. Then you have the second author of the horror, John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy.
Right. John the Fearless is the architect of false hope in this scenario.
What was he doing?
He was outside the city, and he repeatedly promised Rouen a massive relief force. He mustered a weak army, never actually marched it to engage Henry, and finally abandoned the city entirely.
Cowardly, but is it a war crime?
Well, the crucial part is that while he was doing this, he was secretly negotiating with Henry. By stringing the city along with the promise of rescue, he gave the garrison a reason to hold out. If he had been honest and told them no help was coming, they would have surrendered weeks earlier, saving thousands of lives.
The third party is Guy Le Boutier, the captain of Rouen, and the detail work uncovers about him is sickening.
Yeah, this part is hard to read.
The journal points to a specific event on Christmas Day. Despite the brutal siege, Henry V actually offered a temporary truce in honor of Christmas.
A moment of humanity.
Right. He sent priests into the ditch with food for the starving, and he explicitly offered free passage into the English lines for anyone who wanted a meal on Christmas.
And Guy Le Boutier, the French commander, refused to let his people accept it.
Why? I mean, why on earth would a commander refuse to let his starving civilians eat food offered by the enemy?
It comes down to military psychology and paranoia. He likely feared two things: a catastrophic loss of morale and major intelligence leaks.
How so?
If his starving people accepted the enemy king's bread, it would be a very public confession that the French command was incapable of feeding its own citizens, and that the invading English king was actually the more merciful party.
Oh, wow. It would destroy their will to fight.
It would utterly corrode the garrison's will to resist. So, Le Boutier sacrificed his own people's chance to eat on Christmas Day solely to maintain the psychological defense of the city.
It is exactly like a terrible hostage negotiation.
Him.
Imagine bank robbers push a dozen hostages out the front doors of the bank into the freezing snow just to distract the police snipers. The police chief out front refuses to hand out blankets, trying to force the robbers to take the hostages back inside. And instead of resolving it, both sides just dig in.
Right.
The robbers won't open the doors, the cops won't give them blankets, and in the end, the hostages just freeze to death on the steps while the robbers and the police stand there pointing fingers at each other.
That is a very grim, very accurate modern translation of what happened at Rouen.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the fourth and final author of the tragedy, King Henry V himself.
Because he's not innocent here either.
Not at all. He held the standing policy of refusal. He commanded his lines not to let them pass. And work concludes that while this policy is defensively sound in the first 2 weeks, when Henry reasonably expected the city to readmit them, as the weeks dragged on until late December and January, the moral clarity vanishes.
Right, because as you watch people actually begin to die in front of you, you have to ask yourself why you were still holding the line. Was Henry continuing the refusal out of mercy logic? Meaning, was he telling himself, I have to hold this line no matter how awful it looks, because breaking the city's will now is the only way to end this siege and save the 50,000 people still inside?
Or was he acting out of pure leverage logic? Meaning, I am going to intentionally use the agonizing suffering of these innocent women and children as a psychological instrument to break the garrison's will.
Which is the war crime.
Right. And work realizes that from the surviving historical record, it is observationally impossible to distinguish between those two internal intents. The outward action looks exactly the same.
Which brings us to the ultimate lesson of the author's appendix. When you hit that wall, when history cannot tell you a man's true intent, what do?
You have to step back.
Work argues that the historical method forces us to admit we simply don't know, and that reserving final judgment isn't a coward's evasion, it is the height of intellectual precision.
It's being honest about the limits of history.
The text states beautifully that the verdict on Henry's soul, as on theirs, belongs to the judge who alone reads intent. We as historians can sort the acts into categories of guilt. We can identify the terrible choices made, but we cannot and should not attempt to sentence the soul.
It is a profound humility that is often really missing from modern historical analysis. We always want clear villains and spotless heroes. Work's journal forces us to sit in the uncomfortable reality that history is mostly populated by flawed people making impossible choices in the dark.
To step back and look at the incredible value of this document as a whole, this deep dive wasn't just about Joan of Arc's humility or a forged 6th century property law or the grim mathematics of medieval sieges.
No, it's bigger than that.
It is a testament to the absolute power of unhurried associative inquiry.
In a world totally dominated by fast takes, rapid-fire scrolling, and overwhelming information overload, the simple act of sitting down to rigorously explore a wandering thought is revolutionary.
It really is.
Testing an intuition against history, law, and theology, and doing it alongside a tireless interlocutor that holds you to a high standard, it can yield completely original, profound insights. Stephen Work didn't just consume information. He synthesized it into wisdom.
It makes you wonder what else is hiding in the connections between the things we think we already know, if you just take the time to look.
Right.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something for you to ponder that builds on this entire exploration. We've spent this time discussing the immense power of transmission.
Yes.
We looked at how ultimate royal authority was transmitted through individuals who didn't actually hold the throne themselves, like the Virgin Mary or Joan of Arc.
The quiet transmitters who shaped history without reigning over it.
Exactly. I want you to think about your own life and the structure of modern society. We are obsessed with who sits on the throne. We obsess over the kings, the presidents, the CEOs, the loud voices at the top of the pyramid.
The ones making the headlines.
Right. But what if true, lasting historical power doesn't reside with them at all? What if the real power lies with the quiet, seemingly powerless transmitters?
I like that.
The teachers who patiently explain the world to the next generation, the mothers who instill core virtues, the writers who quietly forge new ideas, the mentors who pass the baton in the dark, they are the ones who carry the lineages that actually shape the future.
It shifts our entire understanding of where impact truly comes from. The one who wears the crown or holds the title is very often just the final, visible realization of a much deeper, quieter transmission that happened decades earlier.
Which brings us right back to where we started. When you approach history or when you approach your own life, expecting a vending machine, a clean, straight line of power, transactional data, and obvious answers, you completely miss the complex, messy, incredibly beautiful truth of how things actually work.
You really do.
Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when you step away from the clean answers, wade into the murky waters of inquiry, let the whetstone sharpen your mind, and just let one question lead you wherever it wants to go. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.